around 2000 BC, on the plain near Hebron, in a stretch of country dotted with the great terebinth trees that gave the site its name, Mamre, an old man sits in the entrance of his tent. It's midday, the hour the desert empties itself of travelers, when the sun sits directly overhead, and even nomadic herdsmen retreat into whatever shade they can find. Nothing moves on the plain. And then, in the shimmer of heat rising off the ground, 3 figures appear in the distance, walking toward the camp. Most men in Abraham's position would have watched them pass. He doesn't. He rises and runs. That single decision, not to wait, but to move first, is the hinge this entire story turns on. Everything that follows, the promise, the argument for a doomed city, the fire that falls on it 2 chapters later, traces back to an old man crossing open ground toward 3 strangers he had never seen before and had no reason to trust. He reaches them and bows to the ground before a word has passed between them. "My lord," he says, a single Hebrew word, Adonai, that could mean nothing more than sir, the ordinary courtesy owed to any distinguished traveler. Or it could mean something else. The same word, spelled and spoken identically, is the term reserved elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for God himself. Abraham doesn't pause to clarify which meaning he intends. Whether he knows himself in that first bow is impossible to say from the text. And the ambiguity isn't an accident of translation. It's built into the Hebrew from the very first sentence Abraham speaks. What follows looks, on the surface, like ordinary desert hospitality. It isn't. "Let a little water be brought and rest yourselves under the tree," Abraham offers. Modest, almost apologetic. "Let me get you something to eat, that you may be refreshed, and then go on your way." A little water, a little bread. That's the promise spoken out loud. What actually happens next tells a different story. Abraham runs. The text repeats the verb 3 times in the space of a few sentences. First to the tent, where he tells Sarah to prepare 3 seahs of the finest flour, a quantity that by some estimates would produce far more bread than 3 travelers could eat in a week. Then to the herd, where he personally selects a choice, tender calf, rather than delegating the choice to a servant. The animal is prepared, and Abraham brings curds, milk, and meat, and sets it all before them, then does something the food itself can't explain. He stands. He doesn't recline with his guests to share the meal, the way a host normally would. He stands beside them the entire time they eat, serving rather than sitting, the way an ancient desert host would signal that a visitor's arrival was being treated not as routine, but as something close to providential. There was real risk buried inside that welcome, and it's easy for a modern reader to miss it entirely. In the culture of the ancient Near East, hospitality toward an unknown traveler carried something close to sacred weight, but it had exactly one recognized exception. A stranger suspected of being a spy, sent to scout a settlement before an attack, forfeited every protection that code normally guaranteed. Abraham had no way of confirming, from a distance, across a plain shimmering with heat, which kind of stranger these 3 were. He extended full hospitality before he had any basis for trust. The commitment came first. The certainty, if it ever arrived, came later. It's in the middle of that meal, with the food Abraham prepared sitting in front of them, that the scene shifts into something a documentary camera would linger on. The exact moment ordinary hospitality tips into something else. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" one of them asks. Not who is your wife. They already know her name, a detail that should have registered with Abraham immediately, though the text doesn't record any reaction from him. "There, in the tent," he answers. And then comes the sentence that reorganizes everything about who is actually sitting under that tree. I will surely return to you about this time next year. And Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Inside the tent, out of sight, Sarah is listening. She and Abraham are old by this point in the narrative. Old enough that the text goes out of its way to specify Sarah is long past the age when a promise like this could make any biological sense. She laughs, not aloud, not defiantly. A private interior laugh, the kind meant for no one but herself. After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The visitor hears it anyway. Why did Sarah laugh? That question is the pivot the entire investigation of this chapter turns on, because it requires knowledge no ordinary guest, overhearing a private thought through canvas and distance, could possibly have. And it's exactly here, at this precise moment, that the narrator stops calling the visitors three men and starts naming the speaker directly. The Lord. Investigate the grammar closely enough, and a second mystery opens up almost immediately. If this is a straightforward divine appearance, why does the text keep three men in the frame at all, rather than simply describing one visitor from the start? Readers across the centuries have proposed a Trinitarian reading, three visitors representing three persons of the Godhead, seated together at Abraham's table. It's a compelling image, and an old one. But the text itself resists it with a precision that rewards close reading. A few verses later, when the three rise to leave and look down toward Sodom, the narrative draws a sharp line. The Lord remains behind, standing with Abraham, while the other two continue on alone. When the next chapter opens, the wording is unambiguous. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening. Two, not three. One of the three visitors is consistently, deliberately set apart from his companions throughout everything that follows. So who was the third? The debate has run for centuries without full resolution. One reading holds that all three were created angels, heavenly messengers, temporarily given human form, with the narrator using the divine name simply because they spoke and acted with God's complete authority as his direct representatives. A second reading holds that one of the three was something more, the Lord himself, appearing in visible form, sometimes identified elsewhere in the Old Testament as the angel of the covenant, while his two companions were the created angels who continue on to witness Sodom's fate. The text never resolves the question with total finality. What it insists on, through every careful shift in pronoun and title, is that something more than an ordinary meeting was unfolding beneath those trees. There's no dramatic punishment for the doubt, and no immediate resolution either. Sarah denies laughing at all. I did not laugh, she says, frightened now, and receives a short, unbending correction. No, but you did laugh. The scene simply moves on. The false statement left uncorrected on the record, but not left standing unchallenged. Follow this thread forward through the rest of Scripture, and it resurfaces twice, each time transformed. Centuries later, a different messenger stands before a very different woman, young, unmarried, living in a small town called Nazareth, and tells her she will bear a son under circumstances every bit as biologically impossible as Sarah's. When he answers her disbelief, he reaches for the exact sentence spoken that afternoon under the trees at Mamre. For nothing will be impossible with God. Investigators of Luke's Gospel have traced several deliberate echoes running back to this precise chapter of Genesis. Not coincidence, but a gospel writer consciously reaching into an old story to supply the language for announcing a far greater one. The second echo is quieter, buried inside the Greek translation of Sarah's private thought. There, she refers to Abraham using a specific word, Kyrios, Lord, Master. A New Testament letter, written generations later to encourage women married to difficult or unbelieving husbands, reaches back to seize that exact word. Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and the letter's readers are told they become her spiritual daughters if they share her eventual trust. A passing, half-mocking phrase, caught inside an old woman's private disbelief, becomes, for later readers, a pattern worth building an entire teaching around. None of that has happened yet, though. Back inside the scene itself, the meal is finishing, and the three visitors rise to leave, turning their gaze downward toward Sodom in the distance. What happens next is one of the strangest single sentences in the entire Hebrew Bible. A moment where God, before acting, appears to deliberate out loud, as though thinking through a decision in real time. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? He decides not to, and the reasoning given matters more than it first appears. It isn't only that Abraham deserves to know. The text specifies that Abraham has been known, a Hebrew term carrying the weight of close, intimate relationship, not mere passing awareness. Precisely so, that he will direct his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, doing what is right and just. One decision produces the next. The choosing produces the confiding, and the confiding produces everything that follows over the next 20 verses. Trace that reasoning back to its source, because the history behind it deserves more than a passing mention. The full text reads, "Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." Notice where that reasoning starts. Not with Abraham's merit, with a promise already made, stretching back to the earliest chapters of his story, that all nations on earth would be blessed through him. Confiding in Abraham exists to serve that promise, not to reward him for behaving well. Secrets kept from a father can't be taught to a household, and Abraham has a household to instruct in the way of the Lord. It's a strange kind of trust to extend to a man who, only a few years earlier in the narrative, had lied twice about his own wife's identity out of fear for his life, and who would go on making mistakes well past this chapter. The choosing was never a certification of Abraham's perfection. It was an investment in what he could still become. The same kind of investment Scripture keeps making again and again in people whose track record could never on its own justify what they were eventually entrusted with. That trust has a name attached to it, and the name predates the New Testament by centuries. A prophet, writing generations after Abraham's death, records God speaking of him directly. Abraham, my friend. Of every figure the Hebrew Scriptures record God speaking with, that specific title is reserved for exactly one man. A New Testament letter repeats it word for word. And Jesus, centuries later, tells his own followers they are no longer servants, but friends, reaching, whether deliberately or not, into a category first fixed to the man who ran across open ground to serve 3 strangers a meal. But friendship with God, in the world Genesis describes, was never simply a warm feeling. Commentators studying the book as a whole point out that Abraham's devotion was tested to a point almost beyond bearing, language that reaches forward to a chapter not yet told in this story, when Abraham will be asked to bind his own son on an altar. The intimacy visible under the trees at Mamre, the standing conversation, the confiding before judgment falls, doesn't exist apart from what it will eventually cost the man receiving it. And this particular blurring of messenger into the Lord isn't isolated to this one chapter. The same pattern surfaces earlier in Abraham's story, when an angel speaks to Hagar in the wilderness and is identified by the encounter's end as the Lord himself. It surfaces again later in Exodus, in a burning bush that speaks with God's own voice, and again in Judges, when a visitor eating a meal prepared by a startled host reveals only afterward exactly who he was. Genesis 18 isn't an anomaly in how it blurs the line between messenger and God. It's one recorded instance of a pattern running through the entire Hebrew Bible. Visitors who look, on first appearance, like nothing more than travelers passing through, and turn out, by the story's end, to have been carrying something else entirely. There's a textual clue buried in the manuscript history itself worth pausing the investigation for. The verse describing what happens next reads, "Abraham remained standing before the Lord." But ancient Jewish scribes, copying this text centuries before any Bible printed today existed, left a note, preserved even in modern translation footnotes, indicating the phrase may originally have run the opposite direction, that it was the Lord who remained standing before Abraham, before later copyists, uneasy with how bold that sounded, quietly adjusted the wording. Whichever direction the sentence originally ran, the scene it describes doesn't change. A mortal man, hours earlier, nothing more than a host, serving bread under a tree, is now granted a degree of access that apparently unsettled the very scribes tasked with preserving the record. Two of the three visitors continue down toward the city. The third remains. And what happens next is something no earlier chapter of Abraham's story prepared a reader for: an old man negotiating, city by city, for the lives of strangers he owes absolutely nothing to. This isn't Abraham's first entanglement with Sodom's fate. Years earlier, when the city was raided and its population, including his nephew Lot, carried off by force, Abraham led an armed rescue to bring them back. That earlier intervention used weapons. This one uses only questions. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham begins, and folds a challenge directly into the question. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be that from you. He repeats the phrase twice in a single breath, as though daring the answer to disagree with him. 50 righteous people, he proposes. The answer comes back immediately. If 50 are found, the city will be spared. Abraham doesn't stop there. 45, then 40, then 30, 20, finally 10, each request smaller than the one before it, each answer identical, unhesitating. By the time the negotiation ends, Abraham has walked God down from 50 to a fifth of that number, without a single refusal along the way. He never argues that Sodom doesn't deserve judgment. The case against the city, the text makes clear, is grave and well documented. His entire argument rests on one line instead: "Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" Not a plea for leniency, an appeal to character, a bet placed entirely on who Abraham believes he's actually negotiating with. At one point, he seems startled by his own audacity. "I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes," and presses further anyway, all the way down to 10. This posture, one person standing between judgment and the guilty, negotiating on behalf of people who have no idea an argument is even being made for them, echoes forward through the rest of Scripture. Moses, generations later, offers his own name to be blotted out of God's book rather than let the people be destroyed. A suffering servant, described centuries afterward, is said to make intercession for the transgressors. Abraham's bargaining at the edge of Sodom is the earliest sketch of a pattern the rest of the Bible keeps returning to. Investigate why Genesis preserves the exact numbers in this exchange, rather than simply summarizing the outcome, and the answer says something about what kind of scene this actually is. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. each figure recorded individually, each exchange given its own line of dialogue, rather than compressed into a single sentence. The specificity carries weight on its own. This is a conversation, not a formality. A man testing, step by careful step, exactly how far mercy actually extends, and discovering, at every single step, that it extends further than his own nerve does. Abraham stops at 10, not because patience on the other side of the conversation ran out. The text never records a refusal. It simply records that Abraham stopped asking. By evening, 2 of the 3 visitors arrive at Sodom's gate, and the scene the camera picks up next is a deliberate mirror of the one under the trees at Mamre. Lot, sitting at the entrance to the city, rises the moment he sees them, bows with his face to the ground, and offers almost the exact words Abraham used hours earlier. "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house." They answer, at first, that they'll spend the night in the open square. Lot presses, insists, until they finally relent, and he prepares a meal for them himself, baking unleavened bread, the 2 visitors eating what he sets before them, the same gesture of welcome, staged now in a very different city. For a moment, watching this, it looks as though the code of hospitality that shaped the entire previous chapter has followed the visitors here too. That impression lasts only until nightfall. Before the household has even gone to bed, the text says every man in the city, young and old, all the people from every part of Sodom, surrounds the house. They demand Lot bring the strangers out. Lot steps outside, shuts the door behind him, and tries to reason with a mob that has no interest in reason, offering his own daughters in a desperate, morally indefensible attempt to redirect the violence, and offer the narrative records without endorsing, evidence of how completely the city's social order had already collapsed, reaching even into the household of the one man still trying to protect a stranger. The crowd turns on him instead and surges forward to break down the door. It's at that exact instant that the 2 visitors act. They pull Lot back inside, seal the door, and strike everyone outside with blindness, men groping at an entrance they can no longer even locate. The single narrow exception written into the ancient hospitality code, suspicion of spying, was never remotely in question here. This crowd had abandoned the entire category of hospitality, and the 2 visitors, who had been served bread and meat with reverence that same afternoon, now witnessed, at close range, the precise inversion of everything they'd seen under Abraham's tree. Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone else who belongs to you? Get them out, because we are about to destroy this place. Lot goes to the men engaged to marry his daughters and warns them, and they think he's joking. Nobody in his own household treats the coming judgment as real. By dawn, the visitors are urging him directly. "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters here, or you'll be swept away." Lot hesitates even then. The text records the delay without flattering him for it. And the 2 men finally seize him by the hand, along with his wife and daughters, and force them out of the city, because the Lord was merciful to him, not because Lot moved fast enough on his own initiative. Mercy pulls him through the gate, not merit. Outside the walls, one of the visitors tells him, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you'll be swept away." Even at the edge of catastrophe, Lot negotiates, asks to flee instead to a nearby town rather than the mountains, and is granted the request. The town survives for his sake, later renamed Zoar because of it. Then, the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, from the Lord out of the heavens. Both cities, the entire plain, every inhabitant, everything growing on the ground, gone. Somewhere in the flight, Lot's wife looks back. The text doesn't explain the impulse behind it, doesn't linger on the moral lesson. It simply records the consequence. She becomes a pillar of salt. And then comes a sentence easy to read past too quickly. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. He remembered Abraham, not Lot's own righteousness, not his last-second hesitation finally overcome, not even the direct intervention of the two angels physically pulling him through the door. The text credits Lot's survival to something that happened somewhere else entirely. A conversation the previous afternoon, under a tree, between an old man and a guest he had run to serve before knowing who that guest was. Abraham's bargaining down from 50 to 10 never actually located 10 righteous people inside Sodom's walls. But it located one household worth remembering. And that's the household pulled out before the fire falls. Consider the geography for a moment, because Genesis is precise about it, in a way documentary footage would want to establish clearly. Mamre sits inland, at a comfortable remove from the cities of the plain, close enough that Abraham can look down toward Sodom from where he stands with the Lord, far enough that word of what happens there doesn't reach him overnight. He learns of it the way any observer at a distance would, by walking back the next morning to the same spot where the conversation had taken place, and looking. He looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. That single image, a column of smoke visible across miles of open country, is the last frame this story gives Abraham of a negotiation that had come within a hair's breadth of saving an entire city, and it ultimately saved only one household inside it. Historians of the period place this whole episode inside a documented pattern of desert hospitality that extended well beyond this single family. Traveling without the guarantee of roadside inns or fortified rest stops, a stranger's welcome or rejection genuinely determined whether a journey ended safely. The extravagance Abraham shows, far beyond the minimal offer he speaks aloud, reflects an honor code where the treatment of an unknown guest functioned as a real test of character, not a minor social nicety. Investigators of ancient Near Eastern custom have noted this repeatedly. Societies without formal travel infrastructure developed hospitality codes with almost the force of law, because a stranger denied welcome in the wrong place at the wrong time could simply die of exposure before reaching anywhere else. Set against that historical backdrop, the scene at Sodom's gate reads even more sharply than it does on a first pass. Lot extends, gesture for gesture, the same welcome Abraham offered hours earlier, the same rising, the same bowing, the same insistence his guests not spend the night exposed in the open square. For a documentary camera tracking the two scenes side by side, the visual rhyme is deliberate. Two men in two different cities, performing an identical ritual of welcome on the same night. What separates them isn't the ritual itself, it's what the surrounding community does with it. In one city, that welcome opens into a promise. In the other, it collapses within hours into a scene the text refuses to soften for its readers. There's a final piece of investigative work worth doing before the story closes, tracing what happens to the specific vocabulary of knowing across this pair of chapters. Because Genesis uses the same root word twice in radically different registers. God knows Abraham, intimate, covenantal, relational, the basis for confiding in him about Sodom's fate before acting. The men of Sodom demand to know the visitors at Lot's door, a demand carrying the opposite meaning entirely, violent and predatory rather than relational. The same word, deployed twice within 2 chapters, describing 2 completely opposite postures toward a stranger. One that draws close in trust, one that seizes by force. Genesis rarely repeats vocabulary by accident, and this repetition, tracked across the full episode, sharpens the entire contrast the 2 chapters are already building. Hospitality against violation, welcome against seizure, a tree at Mamre against a barricaded door in Sodom. One more thread worth following before the frame closes on this episode. The 3 C's of flour, the choice calf, the standing service. None of it was demanded by any written law Abraham was bound to follow. What makes the scene worth documenting, worth returning to across 3,000 years of retelling, isn't obligation. It's the gap between what custom required and what Abraham actually gave. Custom asked for water and rest. Abraham gave a feast fit for visiting royalty to 3 men he had never seen before, and would, in one case, never fully identify by name in the record that survives. That gap is where the entire investigation of this chapter finally settles. Not in a resolved answer to who the 3rd visitor was. Not in a tidy explanation of why the Lord deliberated out loud before acting, or why a scribe once hesitated over which direction a single sentence should run. The investigation settles on the decision that made everything else possible. An old man, in the worst heat of the day, choosing to run toward strangers instead of letting them pass. Every promise, every negotiation, every household eventually pulled from a burning city traces back to that one uncomplicated act, performed before anything about its consequences could have been known. Pull back now and look at these 2 chapters together, because Genesis itself seems built for that comparison. The noon scene at Mamre and the night scene at Sodom sit beside each other in the text like a matched pair, staged for contrast. One unfolds in daylight, calm, hospitable, saturated with promise, and closes with an act of intercession that reveals the full reach of Abraham's faith, a concern extending past his own household to an entire city of strangers he owes nothing to. The other unfolds after dark and collapses almost immediately into confusion and ruin, moral and physical both, ending in a degradation more disturbing in its own way than the fire that follows it. Light and darkness, welcome and violence, a meal offered freely under a tree, and a door barricaded against a mob. Genesis never explains the contrast outright. It simply places the 2 scenes back to back and lets a reader feel the distance between them, look closer at what made the first scene possible at all, and the investigation keeps circling back to the same starting point. Nothing about that noon meeting obligated Abraham to anything. No family tie, no prior acquaintance, no debt owed. What he offered came entirely from a conviction, cultural and personal both, that a stranger crossing his path in the worst heat of the day deserved better than being ignored. That conviction, acted on before any identity was revealed, opened every door that followed. The promise to Sarah, the confiding about Sodom, the argument for the righteous, and eventually, chapters and tomes away. Lot's own rescue from a city that had abandoned every version of that same conviction. The 2 households respond to crisis in almost opposite ways, worth noting side by side. Abraham, given nothing but a distant promise about a son he'd wait a full year to see, believes enough to negotiate on behalf of complete strangers. Lot's own future sons-in-law, given an urgent, specific warning about their deaths within hours, dismiss it as a joke. Lot himself hesitates at the very last possible moment, needing to be physically dragged out by the hand. Faith across these 2 chapters isn't measured by how dramatic the warning is. It's measured by what a person does with whatever warning, large or small, distant or immediate, they're actually given. Return once more to the details of that opening meal. because a documentary lens keeps finding more in them the longer it lingers. 3 C's of flour weren't a casual measurement. By some estimates, enough dough to feed dozens, an absurd quantity for 3 travelers passing through. The calf isn't just any animal from the herd. The text specifies it as choice and tender, the kind reserved for occasions a household considered genuinely significant. And Abraham standing rather than reclining while his guests eat reflects a practice documented among desert cultures well beyond this single account. A host remaining on his feet the entire meal as an ongoing mark of respect, refusing even the comfort of sitting until his guests were finished. None of it was required. Water and bread, as Abraham first offers aloud, would have satisfied any reasonable expectation. What he actually delivers stretches so far past that minimal offer that the gap between the two, a little bread, spoken out loud, against an entire calf, fresh bread, curds, and milk, delivered in practice, becomes a kind of statement in itself. His words undersold what his hands were already doing. That same gap between promise and delivery runs through the rest of the chapter. About this time next year is a strangely precise phrase for what amounts to a miracle. Not someday, not when the time is right, but a named season, giving Sarah an actual date to measure her doubt against, and eventually her faith against too, when the promise arrives exactly as specified. The same precision marks the negotiation over Sodom. 50, 45, 40, all the way down to 10. This is a chapter built on exact numbers and exact time frames, not vague reassurance. The God who tells Abraham precisely how many righteous people would spare a city also tells Sarah precisely which season will bring her son. Precision, in both cases, turns out to be its own form of mercy, leaving nothing so vague that faith has to guess at what it's actually waiting for. Which brings the investigation back, finally, to the verse most readers know only in part. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. That instruction isn't hypothetical caution. It's built on precedent, a known story its original readers would recognize instantly. Abraham running toward 3 strangers, serving them a meal fit for royalty, with no advance knowledge of who they were. The writer isn't inventing an obligation. He's pointing back at a documented event and saying, in effect, this already happened once. Don't assume it can't happen again. Sarah's arc across this chapter deserves its own closing note because it's easy to remember only the laugh. She's confronted directly, denies it out of fear, and is corrected without punishment. Caught, corrected, and still standing inside the tent, the promise unretracted despite her doubt. A different New Testament writer, working through a catalog of faithful men and women stretching back to the beginning of Scripture, gives her story its resolution, placing her name among those commended for extraordinary faith, credited by that later point, with believing the very promise she'd once found laughable. Genesis doesn't erase the doubt to make room for the faith that eventually replaces it. It records both in order and lets the second one carry the final word. The identity of the third visitor remains, by design, unresolved. Some readers will continue to see, in the shifting language between 3 men and the Lord, a visible pre-incarnate appearance of God himself, distinct from the 2 angelic companions who continue toward Sodom. Others will read that same shifting language as narrative shorthand for messengers acting with God's complete authority, without requiring one of the 3 to be more than a created being. Genesis doesn't force a reader to settle the question with total certainty. It insists only, through every careful shift in pronoun and title, that whoever sat under that tree was worth the extravagance Abraham gave, long before anyone at that table understood exactly who was being served. What stays constant, whichever reading a person eventually settles on, is the order everything happens in. Nobody announces an identity before the meal. Nobody clarifies who they are before Abraham runs to greet them. The welcome comes first, offered to three ordinary-looking strangers on an ordinary, brutally hot afternoon. And only afterward does anything unusual reveal itself. A promise no one expected, a negotiation no host could have anticipated, and eventually, a household in another city pulled from the wreckage of its own choices because someone, somewhere, had once chosen to run toward strangers instead of waiting to find out who they were first.